The legal breakdown: Trump administration defies court order, sparks constitutional crisis concerns. Brian, Glenn, you and I have had extensive discussions about the potential for a constitutional crisis, particularly in the scenario where a court issues an order, and Trump chooses to disregard it. Well, we're at that point now. Can you break down what happened today? Glenn, absolutely, Brian. We might not be in full-blown constitutional crisis mode just yet, but what we are seeing is the Trump administration openly defying a federal court order issued by Chief Judge Boasberg of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. What led to this situation? A lawsuit was filed after reports surfaced that the Trump administration, through actions linked to Marco Rubio, was planning to deport hundreds of Venezuelans to El Salvador. According to the reporting, there was an arrangement between the U.S. government and El Salvador allowing for the deportation of these individuals. More than 200 Venezuelans were classified by federal authorities as gang members and subsequently detained for deportation. However, the deportation process lacked the legal framework and due process required for such actions. There are established laws governing deportation procedures, which include legal hearings and judicial oversight. Instead, this operation appears to be more akin to forced removal rather than lawful deportation. Federal agents rounded up these individuals, placed them on a flight to El Salvador, and upon arrival, they were reportedly placed in high-security detention facilities with indefinite confinement. These centers, according to reports, have the authority to extend detainee confinement beyond the initial period of 1 year at their discretion. Judicial intervention and administration's response during this process: Chief Judge Boasberg issued an order instructing the Trump administration to halt the deportation. If the planes were already in the air at the time, the order directed that they be turned around and the individuals be brought back to the U.S. The rationale was clear: there was no lawful basis for their removal, and proceeding would cause irreparable harm that could not be undone through legal remedies. Despite this direct court order, the Trump administration seemingly ignored or outright defied it, allowing the deportation to proceed. This raises the critical question: does this situation now qualify as a constitutional crisis? Are we in a constitutional crisis? Some argue that we haven't reached full constitutional crisis territory because this order came from a trial court rather than the Supreme Court. The counter-argument is that defiance of any court order undermines the judicial system and sets a dangerous precedent. A constitutional crisis, in its truest form, occurs when two branches of government reach the peak of their authority and are in direct conflict. This happens when the executive branch enforces a directive that contradicts a Supreme Court ruling, effectively nullifying the court's authority. Since the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of constitutional legality, a defiance of its ruling by the executive branch would signify the collapse of judicial oversight and checks and balances. At that point, if the executive branch disregards the court's authority, the constitutional framework disintegrates, leading to a scenario where governance becomes chaotic and enforcement of laws becomes arbitrary. What happens next? Judge Boasberg is unlikely to ignore this blatant defiance. The next step could involve holding the administration in contempt. If the court finds intentional disobedience, it may issue a show cause order requiring officials to explain why they should not be sanctioned. Contempt proceedings could take two forms. 1. Civil contempt. This would involve imposing fines and penalties as leverage to compel compliance with the court's order. 2. Criminal contempt. If officials continue to defy the order, the court could go as far as ordering jail time for those responsible, with their release contingent on compliance. While extreme, this could become necessary if the judiciary is to maintain its authority. However, the Trump administration appears to be challenging the judiciary, pushing the conflict closer to a breaking point. Addressing concerns over deportation, critics argue that these individuals are dangerous gang members and that their removal is necessary for public safety. However, the key issue here is due process. The executive branch cannot unilaterally declare individuals criminals and deport them without legal proceedings. As a former prosecutor, I strongly believe in enforcing laws against dangerous individuals, but it must be done through the legal system. If the government can arbitrarily declare someone a gang member and expel them without due process, what's to stop them from applying this to other groups? The absence of legal checks and balances threatens not just these individuals but the broader principle of constitutional rights. The bigger picture, the concern now is the precedent this sets. If the Trump administration is allowed to circumvent legal procedures today, what prevents future abuses of power? Could other groups be targeted without due process under the guise of national security or crime prevention? This case isn't just about Venezuelan nationals, it's about whether we uphold the legal framework that governs how deportations and judicial rulings are handled in America. Final thoughts: this situation is escalating rapidly, and while we aren't at the ultimate tipping point of a constitutional crisis yet, we are heading there fast. If further court orders are defied, especially at the Supreme Court level, then we will be in uncharted and dangerous territory. We'll continue monitoring this situation closely. For those following, be sure to subscribe to our channels for updates and independent coverage. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and I'm Glenn Kirschner. This has been the Legal Breakdown.